All right, today we're jumping into a really fascinating theological puzzle, one that comes straight from our source material. And this one, well, it gets right to the very heart of how God's nature is understood in Islamic theology. And boom, here it is. This is the central question for today. On the one hand, you have this core belief that God is absolutely, completely different from anything we know. But on the other hand, you've got scriptures that seem to describe God with hands and eyes and a face. So how can both of those things possibly be true at the same time? That's the tension we're going to unpack. So to really get this puzzle, we have to start with the foundational rule. Our source material makes it super clear that the bedrock of Islamic theology is this idea of a God who is totally separate, totally distinct from the entire created world. There's a specific term for this, tanzih. It basically means God is transcendent, beyond comparison, and definitely not some being with a body. And our source really hammers this home. This isn't just some minor detail. It's presented as a core, non-negotiable claim of Islam. So just lock that in your mind. The starting point is a God who is fundamentally not like anything we can see or imagine. Okay, so you have that principle of a totally transcendent God, right? Well, this is where it gets complicated, because despite that core rule, our source points to passages in the Quran and other texts that describe God using some very specific and, seemingly physical language. And the source points right to the Quran for these examples. We're talking about references to God's face, hands, eyes, even a shin, and God sitting on a throne. This just lays the tension out perfectly, doesn't it? How can a being that's supposed to be utterly unlike creation have attributes that sound so familiar to us? So you've got this apparent contradiction. How is it handled within Orthodox Islamic theology? Well, there's a specific theological principle that was developed to deal with this exact problem. And that principle is called bila kayf. It literally translates to without asking how. The idea here is to just affirm that God has these attributes, a face, hands, etc., exactly as the scripture says. But, and this is the crucial part, to insist that they are not at all like the hands or faces of created beings. It's basically saying, accept the text literally, but you are forbidden from asking how or trying to picture what that means. But this is where our source material really zeroes in. It presents a pretty powerful critique, basically arguing that this bila kayf principle, it doesn't actually solve the problem, not at all. And there it is, the heart of the critique. According to our source, bila kayf isn't a real explanation for the contradiction. It's framed more like an escape hatch, a way to just sidestep a really deep and difficult theological problem without ever actually answering it. The source gives this a name. It calls it anthropomorphism without accountability. So what does that mean? It's the claim that you're attributing human-like qualities to God. That's the anthropomorphism part. But then you refuse to provide any kind of theological framework for it. You're basically shutting down the very questions that your own descriptions create. And to really make its point, the source draws this sharp contrast. It argues that in a theology like Christianity, concepts like symbolism or God becoming human in the incarnation are explicitly defined and explained. But, it claims, this specific approach in Islam asserts these literal physical-sounding attributes and then just forbids any explanation. For the source, this is a major inconsistency. And this quote really captures the source's whole point. It sees a massive contradiction in flat-out denying the idea of incarnation, God taking on a body, while at the same time describing God's eternal nature using terms that sound an awful lot like a body. This last quote from the source really drives it home. It's a jab at what it sees as a kind of hypocrisy, where some Islamic arguments might criticize the poetic or symbolic language in other religions, while, from the source's point of view, not grappling with the very literal descriptions of God in their own texts. And all of this leads to the source's big conclusion. It argues that this tension isn't just a small issue, it's a foundational flaw. The argument is that the whole claim to being a more coherent, more purely transcendent theology actually collapses from within as soon as you shine a light on this contradiction. Okay, so let's just pull back for a second and look at what we've unpacked. What we're really looking at here is a deep theological debate presented by our source that gets to the core of God's nature and the limits of language we use to even talk about the divine. So let's just walk through the logic one last time. It all starts with that core principle. God is absolutely unlike creation. But then, the scripture describes God with what sounds like a face, hands and eyes. The solution offered is bila kref, accept it, but without asking how. And finally, you have the sources critique, which says, nope, that's not a solution. That's the contradiction right there. And so we're left with the really provocative question at the heart of our source's entire analysis. Where exactly is the line between a divine mystery that we just have to accept and a fundamental contradiction that hasn't been examined? It's a huge challenge, mixing faith, language, and logic, and it definitely leaves us with a lot to think about.